For years, a powerful billionaire lived in complete isolation with his only daughter, a girl who was born both paralyzed and unable to speak, diagnosed with severe autism. Doctors gave up. Therapists failed. Nothing changed. The father, despite all his money and influence, couldn't reach his child. That was until a new maid arrived at the estate, quiet, gentle, and grieving her own loss. She didn't try to fix the girl. She simply stayed. What happened next would uncover a shocking truth and change all of their lives forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. William Harrington lived in a huge, quiet estate far away from everything. After becoming one of the richest men in the country, he decided to leave his business world behind. Now all that mattered to him was his daughter, Nora. Nora was born with severe autism and physical paralysis, and she had never spoken a word in her life. William's wife, Eleanor Harrington, had died a few years earlier, and since then his only goal had been to take care of Nora. The estate had doctors, therapists, and special equipment everywhere. Every morning started the same way. William sat by Nora's bed hoping for a reaction, but Nora always stared ahead, saying nothing. Even a small sound or movement would have made William smile, but it never came. Despite everything, William never missed a day. He read books to her, played soft music, and tried to talk, hoping his daughter would understand. But the silence never changed. William spent millions on medical experts from around the world. He flew them in on private jets and offered huge payments if they could help Nora. Some doctors stayed for weeks, trying new methods, running tests, or suggesting different routines. Others left quickly after realizing there was nothing more to do. Therapists came and went. Speech therapists, occupational therapists, even experimental researchers. Some tried new communication devices. Others focused on sensory responses. But no matter what they tried, Nora remained silent and still. William kept detailed notes on everything. He made sure his staff followed strict routines, hoping that structure would help Nora feel safe. Every room was adjusted to meet Nora's needs. Temperature, lighting, and sounds were all controlled to avoid causing her any stress. Yet after every effort, nothing changed. William felt the weight of disappointment every time a new attempt failed. But he refused to give up, even when it seemed hopeless. Most days, William didn't leave the house. He had meetings over video calls, but his thoughts were never fully in them. His full attention was always on Nora. He learned about autism, therapies, and brain functions by reading every article and book he could find. He kept a journal of Nora's behavior. Even the smallest changes, a glance to the side, a flicker of the eye, were recorded and studied. He believed that maybe one day he'd see a breakthrough. Every meal, William sat beside Nora, talking slowly, describing what was on the plate. When he took Nora for walks around the garden, he gently held her hand and spoke about the plants, the sky, or memories of Eleanor. These daily moments gave William a small sense of peace, even when there was no response. He hoped that somehow his daughter could feel the love behind every word, every movement, even if she couldn't show it. At night, the estate was quiet. William often stayed awake, watching the monitors that showed Nora's room. He had cameras installed to make sure nothing was missed. He watched the screen for hours, hoping to see something different, maybe a hand move, a change in facial expression, but most nights were the same. Nora slept calmly without sound or movement. William sometimes walked quietly into the room and sat in a chair beside the bed. He whispered to his daughter, talked about memories with Eleanor, or just stayed in silence. These nights were hard. The stillness made William feel alone. He missed his wife terribly, and more than anything, he wished she could see how hard he was trying. Sometimes he cried quietly, not out of weakness, but because the silence was too strong. He often asked himself if he was doing the right thing, but every time he promised himself he would keep going for Nora. William had power, money, and all the connections he could ever need. In business, he could solve problems quickly. If something was broken, he hired people to fix it. If a deal failed, he made another one better. But with Nora, none of that worked. No amount of money could change her condition. No expert could guarantee a result. William hated feeling powerless. It was something he never experienced before becoming a father. His life had always been about control, success, and results. But now everything depended on something he couldn't force. A reaction from his daughter. This feeling of helplessness was new and painful. He kept trying anyway. Every decision, every action, every dollar spent was for one goal: to hear Nora speak. He imagined it often. Just one word. It didn't matter what the word was. Even a simple "Dad" would change everything. That dream stayed in his heart, giving him the strength to keep going. One afternoon, like many others, William sat in the therapy room with Nora. A therapist was playing with sound devices, hoping to trigger a reaction. William watched carefully, silently hoping that today would be different. Nora sat motionless, her eyes half open, showing no interest in the noise. After a while, the session ended. The therapist shook her head gently and left the room. William stayed behind, sitting next to his daughter. He held Nora's hand and whispered softly, "I'm here, daughter. I'm not going anywhere." He sat there for a long time, saying nothing more, just holding Nora's hand and listening to the silence. This silence, which once made William feel so broken, had now become something he learned to live with. It was painful, but it was honest. He was a father who loved his daughter deeply, no matter what. And despite everything he had done, all he wanted was one thing: to hear his daughter's voice for the first time. Maya arrived at the Harrington estate on a rainy morning. She didn't bring much, just one suitcase and a folded photo of her baby girl, who had died only months earlier. Maya didn't talk much during the interview. William Harrington barely asked questions. The agency had recommended her as someone quiet, efficient, and trustworthy. That was enough. William didn't expect much. Most employees didn't last long in the estate. Some couldn't handle the silence. Others left because they couldn't connect with Nora. But Maya was different from the start. She walked through the house slowly, observing everything without saying a word. She didn't ask about the expensive equipment or the long list of instructions. She listened. When she was introduced to Nora, she didn't try to shake her hand or get her attention. She simply nodded and sat in a corner of the room, folding laundry, as if she had always been there. She respected the space, and for some reason that felt right. Maya didn't treat the job like a task. She moved quietly through the halls, doing her work without drawing attention. In the kitchen, she cleaned without turning on loud music or making unnecessary noise. She didn't ask questions about Nora's condition. She didn't try to give advice or share personal stories. She just did her job and stayed calm. William started to notice her behavior. She never rushed, never forced a smile. There was no fake cheerfulness. It was like she understood that this house had its own rhythm. Slow, silent, heavy. Maya didn't fight that. She adjusted. At lunch, she sometimes sat nearby while William fed Nora. She didn't offer help unless asked. She didn't look away from Nora, but she didn't stare either. Her presence became part of the background, not intrusive, just steady. It was strange but comforting. William, who was always tense around new people, didn't feel the need to explain himself to her. That was new for him. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It was hard to say why. Nothing major had changed. Nora was still silent, still distant, but the feeling in the house was lighter somehow. William found himself less exhausted by the end of each day. Maya continued to stay near Nora during parts of the day, never speaking directly to her unless it made sense. Once she placed a soft blanket on her lap without saying anything. Another time she opened the window slightly when the room felt warm. These small actions done without fuss started to matter. One afternoon, William walked into the room and saw Nora's eyes following Maya as she moved from one side of the room to the other. It was a tiny movement, but it caught William's attention. He didn't say anything, but he felt it. Maya hadn't tried to get Nora's attention, but she had it. And that somehow made more difference than any therapy session. William began to think more about Maya. not in a romantic way, but with curiosity. Who was this woman who had managed to fit into the hardest part of his life without making noise? He checked her file again. No red flags, just notes about her being responsible, quiet, and recently going through a personal loss. He could tell she was still hurting. He recognized the same sadness in her eyes that he saw in the mirror. One evening, as they passed in the hallway, William stopped and said, "Thank you for what you're doing." Maya looked surprised, but nodded softly. "You're welcome," she said, and kept walking. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was the most they had said to each other since she arrived. That short exchange stayed in William's mind for the rest of the night. It was the first time in a long while that he had felt like someone else understood the silence. More time passed, and Maya's presence continued to change things slowly. The staff noticed it too. The estate felt less cold, less like a hospital. Maya didn't talk much with the other employees, but they respected her. She always helped when needed, never complained, and never acted like she was above the work. When new therapists visited, she greeted them politely, but didn't try to impress them. She focused on Nora, even when it didn't seem like Nora noticed her, but Nora did. One day, during a therapy session, Nora turned her head slightly when Maya entered the room. It was small, barely noticeable, but William saw it. He didn't say anything, but inside he felt hope. Maya was doing something no one else had done, not with words or plans, but with patience. She didn't try to break the silence. She lived inside it, and that small difference was creating real change, one quiet moment at a time. Maya started to notice small things about Nora that others had missed. At first they were tiny reactions. One morning, while she was washing dishes in the kitchen, she heard the sound of the tap running and saw Nora move her fingers slightly. Later, when it began to rain, Nora's eyes slowly turned to the window. It wasn't random. Maya began to test quietly and found that water in many forms reached Nora in a different way. She used that discovery gently, short walks to the garden, a seat near the fountain, a moment by the kitchen sink when water ran. The sounds and motions seemed to draw Nora's attention in a way other things did not. She brought Nora near the fountain often, letting the sound and motion be the focus, and watched as small, real responses began to appear more frequently. Very slowly, William began noticing the changes too. At first, he didn't want to admit it to himself. He had seen dozens of specialists come and go, all promising results and leaving only disappointment behind. Yet something about the way Nora's eyes followed Maya as she moved across the room felt undeniable. It was small, subtle, but real. He started watching more carefully, not wanting to scare the moment away. He saw that Nora's body seemed calmer when Maya was near, her face less tense, her breathing easier. For William, who had spent years documenting every flicker of movement, these details mattered more than any doctor's promise. One evening, William lingered in the hallway as Maya passed with a folded blanket in her arms. He found himself thinking not about the silence in the house, but about the rhythm Maya had quietly established. She didn't change the rules of the estate. She didn't bring flashy ideas or medical jargon. She simply fit in, moving at Nora's pace. It was as if she had been there all along, blending with the silence instead of trying to destroy it. For William, this was new. For years, the silence had felt like an enemy, heavy and suffocating. With Maya, it seemed almost natural, even livable. The estate began to shift in ways William hadn't expected. Meals felt less like lonely rituals and more like part of a life. Nora still didn't speak, still didn't move much, but the air felt lighter. William found himself sitting at the table a little longer, noticing how Nora's eyes occasionally drifted to Maya as she worked in the background. It was subtle, but William was trained by now to notice subtlety. Those small looks were everything. Maya continued to bring Nora closer to water whenever she could. She noticed that Nora's fingers twitched slightly at the sound of the fountain, that her head tilted toward the poolside light. Maya never pushed. She never forced words or gestures. She simply let Nora exist near the things that seemed to calm her. William joined them sometimes, staying a step behind, watching carefully. He didn't want to interrupt whatever fragile connection was forming. He saw how Nora's shoulders softened when Maya gently wheeled her chair near the fountain. He saw how her eyes stayed fixed longer than before. These weren't accidents. Something was happening. The difference wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden breakthroughs, but William, who had once stayed up at night begging for the smallest sign, recognized these changes for what they were: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope built on promises from doctors. It was quiet, steady hope born from presence and patience. For the first time in years, he let himself believe. Maya noticed the same. She didn't tell William immediately, afraid of creating false expectations. Instead, she continued quietly testing. She let Nora hear the rain, listen to running water in the kitchen, or sit near the poolside during warm afternoons. Each time Nora showed some small sign of engagement. Fingers twitching, eyes focusing, breath slowing. Maya kept her observations private, writing them down at night in a small notebook she carried. It was her way of making sense of what she saw. She wasn't trying to replace therapy. She was simply watching, learning, and respecting the rhythm Nora chose. One afternoon, William watched from a window as Maya pushed Nora's chair along the garden path. The sun caught the fountain just as they passed, and he saw Nora's head tilt toward it, staying still for longer than usual. William felt his chest tighten. He wanted to run out and ask questions, to confirm what he thought he saw, but he held back. Instead, he whispered to himself, "She sees her." That realization sat with him long after they returned inside. Later that evening, William gathered the courage to ask Maya what she was doing differently. She shrugged slightly and said, "Just letting her be near what calms her." That simple answer struck him more deeply than any medical report ever had. It wasn't about control or systems. It was about noticing and respecting. He thought about all the times doctors had forced toys, sounds, and flashing lights in Nora's face. He thought about how she had withdrawn more each time. Maya wasn't forcing anything. She was waiting. And for William, that was a revelation. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Maya led quiet walks around the pool, sometimes sitting Nora near the water while she read silently on a bench. William often joined from a distance, pretending to check his phone or read a newspaper, while really watching every flicker of Nora's expression. He saw her eyes following the movement of water, her fingers twitching when the fountain splashed. They were tiny signals, but they carried weight. He felt hope not in the loud, dramatic sense, but in the slow, steady way that builds trust. Inside the estate, the difference grew. The once clinical atmosphere softened. Books and toys began appearing in the common rooms. The heavy silence, once oppressive, now carried a gentler weight. William found himself talking more openly at meals, even if Nora didn't respond. Sometimes he would describe the colors in the garden, or recall stories about Eleanor. He knew Nora might not understand every word, but he hoped she felt the love behind them. Maya often sat nearby, folding laundry or preparing tea, her quiet presence anchoring the moment. One evening, William paused outside the therapy room. He watched as Maya wheeled Nora close to the fountain through the open door. She didn't speak. She didn't direct Nora. She simply let her be near the sound. For a moment, Nora's fingers lifted slightly, almost as if reaching. William caught his breath. He whispered softly, though no one could hear him, "That's my girl." It was the closest he had ever felt to hearing her speak. These days weren't without struggle. Nora still spent long hours staring blankly, unresponsive to most attempts at interaction. But William no longer felt entirely defeated. He began to see possibility where before there had only been despair. Maya hadn't promised miracles. She hadn't even spoken much about progress. She just stayed. And her staying was enough to bring the first real change William had seen in years. For William, this quiet transformation felt almost sacred. It wasn't medicine, technology, or money that had shifted things. It was presence. A maid who had arrived with one suitcase and a photo of her lost child had somehow become the key to reaching his own daughter. William didn't understand it fully, but he knew one thing clearly. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like the end of the story. It felt like the beginning. It was a hot afternoon, and the sun was still high in the sky. Maya pushed Nora's wheelchair slowly down the garden path, following the routine they had created over the past few weeks. The garden had become a peaceful space for both of them. She took her near the pool where she usually relaxed. The water shimmered quietly, and Maya sat beside her, wiping her forehead with a cool towel. Nora didn't move much, but her body wasn't tense like it used to be. After a while, Maya noticed sweat on her skin. Her shirt was damp and her hands sticky. It seemed like a bath might help. It was a simple thought, nothing planned, just what made sense in the moment. She gently turned the chair and brought Nora back inside the estate. William was in his study. Maya didn't mention what she was about to do. She just followed instinct. In the bathroom, she took her time. She turned on the water, checked the temperature with her hand, adjusting until it was just right. She filled a plastic basin and set it beside her. Rolling up Nora's sleeves, she carefully removed her shirt. Nora's body was stiff at first, as it often was, but Maya's movements were slow and patient. She dipped a towel into the warm water and began wiping her arms, from shoulders to hands. As she cleaned, she hummed softly, a tune from her childhood. Not a song with words, just a quiet melody, steady and gentle. It wasn't for entertainment. It was to keep the moment calm and safe. Nora didn't react immediately. Her eyes stayed half closed, but her breathing was steady. She wasn't anxious. She felt safe. Maya continued, washing her arms and hands, rubbing carefully between each finger. The bathroom was quiet except for the sound of water in the bowl and the low hum of Maya's tune. She supported Nora's back with one hand to keep her steady while rinsing her arms with the other towel. It was ordinary care, simple and thoughtful, with no expectations attached. That was when it happened. William had been walking down the hallway toward the kitchen when he noticed the bathroom door slightly open. He hadn't meant to spy, but something made him pause. He glanced inside. There was Maya crouched beside the tub, carefully washing Nora's arms. Her face was calm, focused. Then, out of nowhere, a sound broke the silence. A short, light laugh escaped Nora. It wasn't loud, almost like a hiccup, but it was unmistakable. Real. William froze. For a second, he thought he imagined it, but he hadn't. Nora had laughed. The sound struck him like a shockwave. He stood completely still, one hand pressed against the wall. For years he had dreamed of hearing his daughter's voice. Therapists had tried countless games, machines, and strategies to provoke a reaction. None of it worked. Yet now, without planning, without therapy, in the middle of a simple bath, Nora had laughed. Maya heard it too. She didn't make a fuss. She smiled softly and continued wiping her arms as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. Nora's mouth curved slightly, her shoulders loosening. William's chest ached as he watched. He didn't want to interrupt. Slowly, he stepped back from the doorway and leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes, letting the sound echo in his memory. That laugh, small and quiet, was the most powerful sound he had heard in years. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a program. It was comfort, trust. Ordinary care had created a miracle. After a few minutes, Maya finished the bath. She dried Nora's arms, slipped on a clean shirt, and wrapped a towel around her shoulders. Nora didn't resist. She seemed lighter, more at ease. Maya wheeled her gently back toward her room. William stepped aside as they passed. Maya gave him a small nod. She knew he had heard. Later that evening, William sat beside his daughter's bed, watching her sleep. His hand rested lightly on her blanket. That laugh replayed in his mind over and over. It wasn't just a sound. It was proof. Proof that something was happening, something real. Not the kind of breakthrough doctors had described, but a crack in the silence. And even the smallest crack was enough to change everything. For the first time, William felt his daughter reaching toward him. That night, the estate felt different. Maya returned to her room and sat on her bed in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just let the moment sink in. She hadn't expected anything from the bath. She was simply caring for Nora, like always. Yet now there was a memory that would stay with her forever. The first laugh. Not long, not loud. But the first. She held on to it quietly, almost afraid to break it by speaking of it too soon. William, however, couldn't sleep. He wandered through the halls, replaying everything. The bathroom door, Maya humming, Nora's soft laugh. It had happened so quietly, yet it carried more meaning than all the grand attempts of the past combined. Years of silence, broken not by force, but by patience and love. That sound lived in his heart. It wasn't only a laugh. It was a signal, a sign that the silence could be crossed. A bridge had been found, and from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, William woke with a new sense of energy. He still carried doubt, fear, and guilt. But layered over those feelings was hope. It was fragile but real. He found himself listening more carefully, watching more closely. He lingered by doorways as Maya worked with Nora. He didn't interfere, afraid of disturbing what was forming. He simply let it unfold. Quietly, gently. The silence of the Harrington estate had finally been cracked open, and inside it, life was beginning again. After the moment in the bathroom, William could not stop thinking about what he had heard. That soft laugh from Nora had reshaped something inside him. Since that day, he paid even closer attention to the time Maya spent with his daughter. He began to watch from a distance more often, silent, careful never to interrupt. Maya, meanwhile, continued her calm, steady routine. She took Nora outside, sat her near the pool, washed her hands, or read quietly under the shade. Nothing forced, nothing staged. She treated every moment like an ordinary part of the day. When Nora responded, Maya didn't make a scene. She simply accepted it as if it was natural. William realized that this was part of the secret. There were no expectations, only presence. A few days later, something unexpected happened. While sitting near the pool, Maya placed a small yellow rubber duck in a basin of water. It floated gently on the surface. Out of nowhere, Nora lifted her finger and pointed. Then, with surprising clarity, she said one word. Duck. William froze. His chest tightened. He hadn't imagined it. Nora had spoken. Maya looked at her immediately, but she didn't overreact. She simply repeated softly, duck. Nora's eyes stayed on the toy, and again she said, duck. It was slower this time, but still clear. For William, the world seemed to stop. After years of silence, his daughter had spoken her first word. He stood rooted in place, tears filling his eyes. He wanted to shout, to celebrate, to scoop her into his arms, but he held himself back. He didn't want to break the fragile moment. Maya stayed calm, her hand gently resting on Nora's arm. Yes, duck, she said again, voice steady and warm. William quietly stepped away, pressing his hand against his face as silent tears ran down. The sound of that word repeated in his mind endlessly. He knew then that something monumental had begun. The wall of silence was starting to fall, one word at a time. Maya used that moment to introduce more simple objects into Nora's routine. Toys, books, and soft music. She brought picture books with large animal drawings and pointed to each image slowly. She gave Nora time, space to look, to react, or ignore. Sometimes Nora touched the page. Sometimes her eyes followed. Other times she made small sounds. With music, Maya played soft melodies and sometimes hummed along. Nora didn't sing, but she began producing noises, short, quiet, but undeniably hers. They weren't yet words, but they were no longer silence. William often sat nearby, pretending to read or write in a notebook. In truth, his full attention was on Nora. He noted every sound, every flicker of focus, every gesture. He had spent years charting empty pages of silence. Now his notes filled with small signals of life. Each one carried enormous weight. Each one was proof that progress was real. His heart swelled with cautious hope. Outdoor sessions became the highlight of their days. Maya built a rhythm around them, bringing a table with toys, picture cards and books near the poolside. The sunlight reflected off the water, dancing across Nora's face. She seemed calmer in that space, her body looser, her attention sharper. Maya sat beside her, speaking softly, showing her pictures, holding toys. Sometimes Nora copied a sound. Sometimes she said nothing but kept her eyes steady. Each moment mattered. Progress wasn't measured in sentences, but in focus, in effort, in connection. William watched, often with tears forming. For years he had prayed to hear one word. Now he was hearing more. Sometimes Nora attempted bawl when shown a picture, or moo when Maya played the sound of a cow. Other times she laughed quietly at bubbles floating in the air, trying to pop them with her fingers. These weren't isolated reactions. They were signs of communication, signs of life long hidden beneath silence. William's perspective shifted. He stopped waiting for dramatic breakthroughs and started cherishing small victories. When Nora said cat after seeing a photo, William smiled for hours. When she reached for Maya's hand during a song, he quietly recorded the moment in his journal. He began to participate more directly. Maya encouraged him gently. "Just follow her lead," she said. He did. He sat beside them, repeating words, clapping softly when Nora responded, laughing when she made sounds. Slowly, the three of them formed a rhythm. It wasn't therapy anymore. It was family. By the end of the week, the poolside had transformed from a decorative spot into something sacred. It was where Nora found her voice, where she laughed freely, where she pointed, where she spoke her first word. For William, it became the heart of hope. Each afternoon, as he sat with his daughter and Maya, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Joy. Not fleeting relief, but real joy. It didn't come from therapists or doctors. It came from patience, silence and love. Inside the estate, the changes grew visible. The once cold rooms now carried warmth. Toys scattered across the floor. Open books rested on tables. Music played softly in the background. On the fridge, Maya taped one of Nora's first drawings. William, who once walked the halls like a shadow, now laughed openly, joining in during playtime. He no longer lived only in desperation. He lived in presence. Each day carried meaning. Each day carried connection. The silence of the estate had been rewritten. No longer an enemy, it had become a pause, a space between words, between laughter, between gestures filled with life. From that day forward, William looked at the pool not as an ornament, but as a sanctuary, a place where his daughter had broken years of silence, a place where hope had been born again. That laugh in the bathroom had opened the door. The word duck had carried them through it. Nothing, not even years of pain, could erase that truth. Nora was speaking, slowly, softly, but truly speaking. And William, once hopeless, now lived for every sound. One morning, while cleaning the study, Maya opened a cabinet that had not been touched in years. Inside were boxes of papers, old files, and stacks of medical documents. She began sorting them into piles, wanting to bring order to the mess. Most folders carried dates and the names of clinics, therapists, or hospitals. Out of curiosity, she opened a few. What she found left her shaken. Page after page revealed aggressive treatments, heavy medications, and methods that looked more like control than care. Some reports described Nora's behavior as unmanageable and recommended strong sedatives. Others suggested isolation or even physical restraints. Maya's hands trembled as she read. The gentle child she had come to know had once been treated like a problem to be managed, not a person to be understood. She placed the files into a box, her stomach tight with unease. She couldn't ignore what she had read. Later that evening, she carried the box to William. He sat down slowly, lifting one document after another, scanning each line carefully. At first his face showed confusion, then disbelief, and finally a crushing weight of guilt. He hadn't known the full extent of what had been done. Back then, after Eleanor's death, he had been broken and desperate. Doctors had used complex language, promised results, and he had believed them. He had signed papers without question, trusting they were helping. Now, reading these reports, he saw the truth. Much of what Nora endured had not been about healing. It had been about control. William closed a folder with shaking hands. His voice was barely audible when he said, "I let this happen. I let them do this to my daughter." Maya did not rush to comfort him. She did not tell him it wasn't his fault. Instead, she spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to do something." He nodded, understanding. The past could not be undone, but it could no longer remain hidden. Together, they began sorting every file, creating a timeline of Nora's treatments, medications, and the professionals involved. The truth needed to come to light. Maya contacted a lawyer she trusted from a previous job. When he saw the records, he was stunned. Many treatments violated medical ethics. Some possibly broke the law. William then reached out to a journalist known for covering health and special needs cases. She agreed to meet them and listen. Within a week, William and Maya had compiled enough material to begin building a case. It was painful work. Every page reminded William of how much Nora had suffered under his watch. But he pressed on, not out of revenge but out of duty. The truth had to be told. Even as the legal process began, life at the estate did not stop. Nora still needed care, patience, and love. Maya continued her routines. Afternoons by the pool, quiet walks in the garden, story time in the living room. William joined whenever he could. He knew that no lawsuit or article could change the daily reality of his daughter's world. What mattered most was her progress, her comfort, her growth. Each new sound or look from Nora reminded him why he was fighting. She was not broken. She had never been incapable. She had been misunderstood, medicated into silence, treated like a problem instead of a person. Now, finally, someone was listening. As the story gained traction, more families began to speak out. Parents of autistic children reached out with their own experiences of misdiagnosis, unethical treatments, and pressure to medicate. The journalist published a detailed article that drew national attention. Soon interviews followed. William chose to speak publicly, not as a billionaire, but as a father. He didn't hide his guilt. He admitted the mistakes he had made, the blind trust he had placed in professionals, and the harm that followed. His openness struck a chord. Maya stayed beside him, quiet but strong. She didn't seek the spotlight. Her role was to be with Nora, but everyone who learned the story understood her importance. She had been the first to truly see Nora, and now the world was beginning to see her too. The media began calling it a movement, a push to rethink how autistic children were treated, to prioritize compassion over control. But inside the estate, the noise of headlines and calls mattered less. For William and Maya, it was personal. Their focus stayed on Nora. She continued to surprise them with new words, new sounds, and new connections. She smiled more often. She pointed to objects she wanted. One afternoon, while holding a toy, she looked straight at William and said, "Blue." His heart nearly burst. That one word carried more meaning than all the articles and court filings combined. It was proof. Proof that Nora had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to be heard. The legal case pressed on. Lawyers prepared documents, experts reviewed the files, journalists called daily. Yet in the estate, peace was beginning to grow. Maya and William balanced the fight for justice with the everyday rhythms of life. Nora's laughter in the garden, her attempts at new words during story time, the way she relaxed by the pool, these were the victories that mattered most. The outside world demanded attention, but the true transformation was happening quietly inside their home. For William, the contrast was striking. In business, battles were won with power, money, and influence. But with Nora, victory came through patience, silence, and love. Each evening, when the house finally grew quiet, William often found himself watching Nora sleep. He would think about all the years wasted on treatments that had only silenced her. He would think about Eleanor and how she never got to see this progress. He would think about Maya, the woman who had arrived with one suitcase and somehow changed everything. Guilt still weighed on him, but alongside it now lived something else: determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future. And for the first time, he believed that future was possible. As news of the case spread, life inside the Harrington estate continued to evolve. While reporters called and lawyers drafted statements, Maya kept her attention firmly on Nora's world. Their daily routines had grown into something steady and rich. Each morning began with simple exercises at the kitchen table. Maya used picture cards with words like ball, book, and water. Slowly, carefully, she would hold them up and give Nora time to respond. One day, when Maya showed the card for ball in Portuguese, Nora smiled faintly and said ball in English, pointing at the red ball beside her. Maya noted it instantly. Another time, when asked if she wanted to read, Nora softly said, read. These weren't rehearsed responses. They were real, natural progress. Maya kept a notebook where she wrote down every word, sound, and gesture. William, too, stayed close. He no longer watched from the shadows. He participated. He repeated words, clapped gently when Nora spoke, and joined during playtime. For years his journal had been a painful record of silence. Now it filled with words and laughter. They were no longer waiting for progress. They were living it. Maya introduced creative activities to help Nora express herself in new ways. She brought out finger paints, wide sheets of paper, and safe brushes. At first, Nora only watched. But one afternoon, Maya dipped her finger in blue paint and guided it toward the page. Nora hesitated, then pressed her finger down, leaving a mark. Something about the texture caught her attention. She dipped her finger again, this time without help, and made another mark. A smile flickered across her face. William, standing behind, recorded the moment on his phone, barely able to contain his joy. Soon painting became part of their afternoon ritual. Maya set up a small art corner in the living room with paints, brushes, and paper. Nora experimented freely. Sometimes she mixed colors. Sometimes she used her entire hand to smear paint across the sheet. It didn't matter if it formed shapes. What mattered was the expression. Through paint, Nora found another way to connect with the world. William often joined, trying his hand with brushes. His messy strokes made Maya laugh, and Nora giggled too, delighted by his attempts. These moments filled the estate with a life that had once seemed impossible. Story time also transformed. Maya selected books with bold pictures and short sentences. She read slowly, pointing at each image, giving Nora time to respond. Nora began reaching out to turn pages herself. Sometimes she made sounds at the sight of a picture. Once, during a story about animals, she pointed at a dog and said dog before Maya even reached the word. Another time she laughed aloud during a funny scene. These weren't small to William. They were miracles, each one proof that his daughter was no longer lost in silence. Maya also introduced bubbles into their play. She blew streams of soap bubbles across the garden, and Nora chased them with her eyes, sometimes lifting her hand to pop one. The laughter that spilled out during these games was light and free, filling spaces that had once been cold and still. William watched, sometimes joining, sometimes sitting quietly, content just to see his daughter joyful. It wasn't about therapy anymore. It was about life. Communication grew beyond words. Nora developed her own rhythm of signals. A point towards something meant she wanted it. A small tap meant she wanted to repeat an activity. Sometimes she made a sound and waited. Maya answered with a similar sound, and they repeated it together like a game. William learned this rhythm too. He began reading her gestures, understanding her in ways that doctors had never managed. Nora didn't need full sentences to be understood. Her expressions were enough. The estate itself reflected these changes. No longer did it feel like a sterile environment designed for control. It felt like a home. Toys sat scattered across the floor. Art from Nora's sessions decorated the walls. Soft music drifted through the rooms. Cushions for play lay in corners, and stacks of picture cards were ready by the couch. William, once consumed by work or despair, spent most of his time in these rooms. He no longer looked worn and defeated. He laughed more. He listened. Hope no longer frightened him. It gave him strength. The pool remained a central space in their days. Almost every afternoon, Maya and William brought Nora outside. They filled the water with floating toys, bright and colourful. Nora didn't swim on her own, but with support, she kicked her legs and splashed with her hands. She laughed often, sometimes when drops of water hit her face. In the water, she seemed more confident, more alive. Maya noticed she spoke more sounds near the pool. She used this gently, asking questions like, "What colour?" while holding up toys. If Nora answered, they celebrated softly. If she didn't, they moved on without pressure. William created games like counting splashes or making silly faces. Nora loved them. The pool became a place of freedom, a sanctuary where she felt safe to try. Inside, the transformation continued. The silence that had once suffocated William was gone. What remained was a rhythm of life. Music, laughter, conversations of a new kind. Even when Nora was quiet, it no longer felt like emptiness. It was simply part of the flow, pauses between words, breaths between moments of connection. William often stopped just to take it in. His daughter painting with focus, Maya wiping her hands gently, the sunlight catching on water outside. These were not dramatic miracles. They were ordinary moments, but alive, honest, and full of meaning. William realized that his idea of progress had changed. He no longer measured Nora's future against expectations of normal. He no longer begged for impossible transformations. Instead, he cherished her world exactly as it unfolded. Every word, every gesture, every sound was a gift. And together, he and Maya had built an environment where those gifts could surface naturally. For William, who had once felt powerless, this was redemption. For Maya, who had carried her own grief silently, it was healing. And for Nora, it was freedom. The estate was no longer a place of silence. It was a place of voice, laughter, and love. Over time, Maya became more than the woman who cared for Nora. She became part of the family. Her presence was no longer something new or temporary. It had settled into the heart of their daily life. William trusted her completely, and Nora looked for her every morning. They shared meals, reading sessions, painting afternoons, and walks in the garden as a unit. There were no labels, no official roles to define it. They were simply together, bound by presence and care. When one grew tired, the other stepped in. When Nora laughed or said a new word, they celebrated as one. They did not always agree, but they respected each other, and the bond deepened naturally. One morning during an art session, Nora picked up a crayon and drew 3 simple figures. The shapes were rough, childlike but clear, 3 people holding hands. She pointed at the drawing and said softly, "It's us." Maya's eyes welled instantly. William leaned closer, his breath caught. The message was undeniable. Nora saw them as a unit, connected, safe, together. For William, it was proof that his daughter felt the bond as strongly as he did. For Maya, it was the confirmation that her place in their lives was real. She placed the drawing on the refrigerator, pressing it flat with trembling hands. No one needed to explain further. That picture spoke more than words could. That afternoon, the 3 of them abandoned the routine. No therapy, no lessons, no scheduled activities. They sat in the living room quietly, surrounded by toys, books, and the sound of soft music. Nora leaned against Maya's shoulder, her crayon drawing pinned just across the room. William watched in silence, feeling peace in a way he had not felt since Eleanor's death. The pain of the past was still there, Maya's grief for her daughter, William's guilt for the years of failed treatments, but it no longer isolated them. Instead, it connected them. They didn't need to explain. They simply understood. When William felt overwhelmed, Maya listened without judgment. When Maya felt heavy, William respected her silence. Together they carried pain as something shared, not something endured alone. Some nights after Nora had gone to bed, they sat outside beneath the stars. Sometimes they spoke about their losses, sometimes about the day, sometimes about nothing at all. These talks were not dramatic. They were simple and real. Maya never tried to erase William's guilt. and he never asked her to forget her grief. They just shared it, and in the sharing it softened. It became something lighter, something possible to carry. As weeks passed, the estate settled into a rhythm that felt stable and strong. The legal battle still continued. Lawyers pressed forward. Journalists followed up. Headlines carried the story. But inside the estate, it no longer dominated their lives. Their focus was Nora. Each morning began with breakfast together, followed by reading or painting. Afternoons brought walks or time by the pool. Maya introduced small experiments, new textures, puzzles, gentle sounds, and observed Nora's reactions. Some she ignored, others caught her attention. Each detail was written down. William began to see growth not in sudden leaps, but in the details. The way Nora waited for Maya's voice, the way she reached for his hand at mealtimes, the way she smiled more often. Progress was no longer an abstract dream. It was real, daily, visible. The estate itself reflected the transformation. Once sterile and silent, now it carried warmth in every corner. Art decorated the walls. Books lay open on tables. Music floated through the halls. Toys scattered across rugs. William, who once walked the corridors like a ghost, now laughed openly, joined games, and read aloud during story time. The silence that once crushed him was gone. When it came now, it felt natural, just a pause between moments of laughter or speech. The estate had become a home again. One sunny afternoon, William sat by the pool watching Maya blow bubbles for Nora. She clapped and giggled, chasing them with her eyes. William leaned back in his chair, letting the sound fill him. He no longer feared the future in the same way. For so long, silence had meant despair. Now it simply meant possibility, a pause before the next word, the next smile. He realized that perfection was never the goal. What mattered was this: a home full of warmth, presence, and care. Nora still had difficulties. She did not speak full sentences, and some days she needed quiet. But those challenges no longer defined her. She was no longer just a girl with limitations. She was a girl with preferences, joy, and a growing voice. The pool remained her sanctuary. Each splash, each laugh, each sound she made, there was celebrated. William marveled at how different it all felt from just months ago. Back then, he had believed silence was permanent. Now it was only temporary, a brief space before something beautiful. One evening, after putting Nora to sleep, William and Maya sat in the kitchen with cups of tea. On the refrigerator, Nora's drawing still hung. But now there was another beside it. 3 figures again, this time with wide smiles. William traced the crayon lines with his eyes. "She's happy," Maya said quietly. William nodded. "We all are." The words weren't dramatic. They were true. They didn't need more explanation. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was whole. The silence, once suffocating, had become part of the rhythm of their home, a space between joy, between connection, between glances that said everything words could not. Nora was still growing, and so were they, together as a family. The trial finally reached its end after weeks of tense hearings. Inside the county courtroom, lawyers presented evidence, expert witnesses gave testimony, and parents from other families shared their stories. William sat through every session, Maya often beside him, quiet but steady. He rarely spoke to the press waiting outside, but his eyes revealed the weight he carried. Across the room, the doctor once praised in elite circles sat silent, listening as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts, misconduct, negligence, and emotional harm. The courtroom froze for a moment, then filled with quiet gasps. William closed his eyes. Justice had been done. It did not erase the past, but it acknowledged the truth. After years of silence, someone had finally answered. There was no celebration, no victory party. William simply returned to the estate with Maya and Nora, feeling that something heavy had been lifted, though the scars remained. He walked the halls of the house differently that night. For the first time, he didn't feel like a prisoner in his own home. He felt like a father with a purpose. Soon after, William made a decision. He wanted to give Nora a space of her own. He walked through the estate until he reached a room once used for storage. Large windows stretched across one wall, flooding it with light. For years it had been filled with boxes and dust. Now he imagined something else. He hired a contractor to clear the space, repaint the walls, install new lights, and add shelves. Within weeks, the room was transformed into a bright, open art studio. Maya helped arrange it. Jars of brushes on the shelves, stacks of blank paper on tables, rows of paints lined neatly in colors that shimmered beneath the sunlight. A small speaker stood in the corner for music. In the middle of the room was a wide table where Nora could sit or stand with ease. When she entered for the first time, her eyes widened slightly. She scanned the walls, the shelves, the table, as if realizing it was meant for her. Maya handed her a brush. Without hesitation, Nora dipped it into blue paint and pressed it against the paper. A mark appeared. She smiled. William watched from the doorway, his chest tight with emotion. It wasn't just painting. It was expression. It was voice in color. The studio quickly became Nora's favorite place. Each day she spent time there, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming simple melodies while choosing colors. Blue dominated her early work. Soft strokes, bold splashes, endless shades. William and Maya recognized it instantly. Blue was the color of the pool, her sanctuary. Other colors followed, yellow for sunlight, green for the garden, red for her toy truck. Each painting seemed to carry meaning, a language that didn't need words. Maya always stayed nearby, patient and gentle. She never corrected or directed. She let Nora lead. Some days Nora whispered the names of colors as she painted. Other days she sang fragments of tunes, the room filled with the rhythm of brushes, laughter, and music. William often stood at the door, simply watching. Each canvas felt like a letter from his daughter, a message once hidden behind silence, now shared openly. Life inside the estate changed completely. The rooms no longer echoed with loneliness. Now there were toys on the floor, drawings taped to walls, and the smell of Maya's cooking drifting through the halls. William, once haunted by guilt, now laughed easily. He joined Nora at the table, sometimes mixing paint, sometimes just clapping when she smiled at her work. Maya teased him when his strokes were clumsy. Nora giggled when he splashed paint by accident. Laughter became part of the daily rhythm, blending with the hum of music and the quiet of shared moments. Nora hugged more often. She asked for her favorite songs. She pressed her painted hands against the wall of the studio, leaving colorful handprints that William helped preserve. Every detail mattered. The smell of wet paint, the sight of her blue-stained fingers, the sound of her voice naming colors. These weren't extraordinary events. They were ordinary, and that was the miracle. William realized happiness wasn't a distant dream anymore. It was their everyday life. Often he paused to observe. Sometimes he joined in. Sometimes he just stood quietly, taking it all in. Nora painting with focus, Maya wiping her hands carefully, sunlight falling across the canvas. He thought about the man he had been, desperate, controlling, consumed by silence. That man was gone. In his place stood a father who had learned to live in the moment. He didn't need dramatic breakthroughs. He had what mattered: connection, joy, a family rebuilt not by money or power, but by patience and love. The judgment in court had brought closure. The art studio had brought purpose. And Nora's progress had brought light. For William, that light filled every corner of the estate. He no longer looked at the past as a prison. He saw it as a lesson. The silence that had once defined their lives was no longer present. What remained was color, laughter, and voice. Nora kept painting, singing, and speaking more words each day. Her connection to the world grew stronger. She no longer felt distant. She was present, alive, expressive. William no longer spoke about the future with fear. He focused on the now, and the now was good. He still carried worry at times, but it no longer ruled him. The estate, once a house of grief, had been rebuilt into a home of joy. The healing was not partial, it was complete. For the first time in years, Their life felt whole. Several years passed, and Nora grew into a teenager, taller, more confident, with her own rhythm and voice. A national event was organized in the Grand City Auditorium to honor individuals who had shown remarkable courage and progress through personal challenges. Among the names announced was Nora Harrington. Her story had reached thousands, first as a child who broke years of silence, later as a voice of hope for others. She was invited to speak, and she accepted. The auditorium filled with families, professionals, journalists, and supporters. Lights shone across the stage as Nora walked forward, Maya by her side. Nora wore a blue suit, her favorite color since childhood. Maya held her hand as they climbed the steps together. Cameras flashed. The moment felt monumental. Yet what came next held even greater meaning. The host announced something unexpected. Maya was now Nora's legal adoptive mother. The crowd erupted in applause. Maya turned to Nora, overwhelmed, tears rushing down her cheeks. She covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back the emotion. Nora looked at her and smiled softly. In front of everyone, she wrapped her arms around Maya and held her tightly. The crowd rose to their feet. Some clapped, some wiped tears. The bond between them was undeniable, stronger than any paper or legal declaration could capture. Maya had been her mother for years in every way that mattered. Now it was written in law. William sat in the front row, watching with quiet pride. He didn't need to speak. His expression said everything. The man who once lived in guilt now found peace, knowing his daughter was safe, loved, and thriving. When it was time for Nora to speak, she stepped to the microphone. She unfolded a sheet of paper she had prepared, took a deep breath, and began reading with a steady voice. Her words carried through the auditorium. "My light began at the pool," she said, pausing to glance at Maya, who smiled through tears. "Before that, I didn't know how to speak. I didn't know how to show what I felt. But she waited. She saw me, and now I'm not afraid." Her sentences were simple, but they struck deep. "I used to live in silence. Now I live with love." The hall grew quiet, not empty, but full of emotion. Each word held weight. Each pause carried meaning. When she finished, the audience stood again, clapping, some crying openly. Nora looked proud, not nervous. Maya wrapped her arm around her as they walked off the stage together. Hands reached out from the crowd, offering thanks, admiration, and encouragement. At the reception afterward, families gathered around them. Parents brought their children forward. Some shared stories of silence, of years of struggle, of medical systems that had failed them. They thanked Nora for her courage, thanked Maya for her patience. One mother hugged Maya and whispered, "You showed us it's possible." A father with tears in his eyes told Nora, "Because of you, my son spoke in front of his class for the first time." Every story was a reflection of their own journey, mirrored in the lives of others. William also received quiet words of respect. Many acknowledged his decision to step back, to allow Maya's role to shine. He listened, humbled, never seeking credit. That evening was not about him. It was about Nora, about the bond they had built, about hope spreading far beyond the walls of the Harrington estate. When they returned home that night, the house felt warm and familiar. Nora walked to her room still dressed in her blue suit, holding the medal from the ceremony. On the shelf above her desk sat an old drawing, the one she had made years ago of 3 figures holding hands. She placed the medal beside it carefully. The drawing had faded slightly with time, but its meaning was unchanged. William, Maya, and Nora. A family drawn in a child's hand, lived out in reality. Nora stood quietly, staring at the picture. Maya entered the room, and without a word, Nora turned and hugged her again. Maya closed her eyes, holding her tightly. In the hallway, William passed by and smiled when he saw them. He didn't intrude. He didn't need to. This was their family, built not by blood but by time, love, and truth. The silence that once haunted the estate was gone. In its place were new sounds. Nora's voice reading books aloud, soft music in the kitchen, laughter drifting down the halls. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined them. Maya was no longer just the caretaker who arrived during a storm. She was Nora's mother in name, in role, and in heart. William, too, had changed. He no longer lived as a man burdened by failure. He had learned to love without control, to trust, to step back and let life unfold. And Nora, once silent, now stood proudly on stages, sharing her voice with the world. That night, as the estate grew quiet, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful, filled with meaning. No longer the silence of despair, but of calm. A silence that held love within it. A silence that carried the memory of a laugh, of the word duck, of colors painted across paper, of a crayon drawing pinned to a refrigerator. A silence that spoke louder than words. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.